Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I want to talk to you about an important distinction between ego repression and ego transcendence, which is a common trap to fall in for those seeking enlightenment. Alright, so if you're familiar with my videos and what I've been talking about so far, basically 6.5 and 7 years ago I had two different enlightenment experiences, which I use just kind of as a general way to refer to it because enlightenment isn't really an experience. But during these particular experiences, I was able to see through the illusion of my ego and essentially was able to get a good glimpse of non-duality consciousness. And so ever since those experiences, I have been falling very much into many of the traps those that seek enlightenment fall into. And this distinction that I'm going to be talking about between ego repression and ego transcendence is one of those very common traps. So for many enlightenment seekers, there's this false notion that you have to destroy the ego or somehow kill the ego in some way. And from my experience, that is absolutely going 180 degrees in the wrong direction. This is why it's so important to make the distinction between ego transcendence and ego repression, which are two completely different things. Alright, so before I go into the differences between ego transcendence and ego repression, I want to give a little bit of information about what the ego is in a practical sense. So in a practical sense, what the ego is it's a huge collection of thoughts, all connected in the center by one singular thought that you call me. So you have this I thought in your head that you think that you are, and then you have all of these different concepts about yourself and the way that you relate to reality attached to that. Now the problem with this is that the I thought itself is an illusion, and so you feel like you have to protect and advocate for that identity, for that I thought, and so you come up with all of these different thoughts and beliefs and concepts, and maybe you sustain some traumas and maybe some complexes get woven into the ego and some neuroses here and there, and all of those to essentially protect and be the steward of that imaginary I thought. And so this huge collection of thoughts that is the ego becomes a very, very heavy burden to carry because you're constantly having to watch out for something that has no physical reality of its own. So for example, your body, of course you have to protect your body, and so you have to be looking out in the environment for things that might be destructive to the body or might cause you some kind of bodily harm. What the ego does is it makes you think that this I thought is real and that it needs the same kind of protection as you would give to the physical body. But because the I thought is not real, all of these concepts and complexes and neuroses and various things that you've been using to protect the ego are essentially a really heavy burden to carry for nothing. This I thought is also what gives you the illusion of separation between yourself and everything else in reality when there's really no separation there. And so we can do a lot of things to undermine our own health and the health of our society because we're clung so much to this idea that we're separate. So because the ego is not really real in and of itself, it's just an illusion. What it is a collection of thoughts. And so you cannot kill a collection of thoughts and you cannot destroy a collection of thoughts. You can only see through it. You can only see it as it actually is, which will make it lose all of its charge and power and make all of those beliefs and complexes and neuroses that you've been chained to sort of disperse and scatter to where they don't have primary importance in your daily life. So saying that you're going to kill the ego is a lot like saying you're going to kill your imaginary friend to get rid of your delusion that you have an imaginary friend. So because the only way to actually transcend the ego is to see through its illusion, we actually have to first allow the ego to do what it does, because any resistance to part of reality is going to keep you squarely away from seeing the truth as it is, which will keep you from enlightenment. So in a practical sense, let's go ahead and talk about what ego transcendence is. So ego transcendence is essentially seeing through the illusion of this I thought and noticing that there's really no distinction between yourself and everything else out in reality. So when you're able to let go of this huge ball of beliefs and be unchained from it, suddenly you're liberated from all of the limits that you've had. And life becomes light again, and you become able to let in love from all around you. So if you have any issues with neuroses or various things that are just like psychologically bothering you that don't come from a physiological source, like if you don't have like brain chemistry won't really change here, but let's say that you have developed some sort of behavior or something in order to adapt to a negative situation that just hung around, those things you'll be able to let them go because you'll see that there's no actual ego to protect. You don't have a self inside of you that needs to be protected from your emotions at all time. In fact, you'll be allowing of both positive and negative emotions because there is no separate self to harm. They just become phenomenon like any other phenomena in nature. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about my personal experiences with ego transcendence. Now, I do want to say that that is not the paradigm that I'm living from right now. I'm not an enlightened person, and I still very much live under the illusion of ego. But again, I've had these two glimpses of ego transcendence, and so I can kind of speak from memory, even though that's not really even a perfect memory because it's been so long and things kind of tend to fade out and become usurped by other things. But I still think that it's important for me to share what it was like practically to see through the illusion of ego, and I think that it might be helpful for those seeking enlightenment, or at least not to fall into the same traps. All right, so the first experience, I didn't expect anything from it. I was not a spiritual person at all. I had always been interested in knowledge and intellect, but I had a very big allergy to anything that related to God or spirituality at all. And so what was most striking to me, though, is that I ceased to see myself as separate from anything in nature. There was this deep knowing that I was connected with everything else. And so this one wasn't such an insight-heavy enlightenment experience, if you're going to call it that. It was basically just being completely bathed in love because I realized that love was all that there was. Like I was love and the whole entirety of existence was love. And in that I was completely connected. And it was very clear to me that because of my clinging to my identity and these rules that I had ascribed to as an outgrowth of clinging to my ego, I was unable to experience this divine love. And I knew right then that I was experiencing the phenomenon that religions had attempted to call God or Allah or fill in the blank any type of religion or spiritual doctrine's name for a supreme power. So it was very evident to me that I was both whole and part of that whole thing, and that thing had this love and intelligence to it that really bound everything together in nature, and that there was nothing on earth and nothing in existence that was invalid. My second experience, which was 5 months later, was a lot more insight heavy, and it came during a time of great chaos in my life. And this was the one that really started to make me realize how much I had been lying to myself constantly about who I was and what my value was. So prior to this experience, I had a very, very definite sense of self, and I had a clear moral code. I had certain principles where I would say, okay, this is good, this is neutral, and I'm going to be tolerant and acceptance of that, and that's bad, and I'm going to be not accepting of that. And that was kind of my idea, and I thought that I was very right with that. You know, and there were so many ways that I had built myself up. Like I really kind of had created my ego as kind of a masterpiece because I was always sort of living my life as though someone would be making a movie of it. And so I was always trying to do really ironic, interesting things. And sometimes I would put myself right in the middle of chaos just because I thought that it would make my life story more interesting. And it was causing me a lot of issues. And then I also had this kind of almost like a Jesus complex where I couldn't get angry at anyone, or I had to be the absolute most laid back, most moral person, which really tied my hands in many ways. And then I had an extreme attachment to success and self-actualization. And so I was constantly trying to add more value to Emerald Wilkins. And I was doing quite well at it. You know, I was always getting A's in my school endeavors, and I had a very clear idea of where I wanted to go with my goals. And this whole time I was just trying to create more and more value for this separate person called Emerald. And what I didn't realize until I had those experiences is that this drive came from a very, very negative place, a place of self-hatred and self-deception. Because when I had the second experience, it became immediately clear to me that I didn't need to strive or struggle to create a sense of value for myself or a sense of significance, because the thing that made me significant wasn't anything that I was doing. It was just by my very being and existing. Because I exist, I belong to this infinitely important, infinitely loving thing. And I wasn't able to be receptive to that before, because I was constantly clinging to this idea of I need to achieve high and create significance for myself. And I even had this goal in mind that I would live the most interesting life possible, and that I would try to get famous toward the end of my life so that people 100 years from now or 200 years from now or 300 years from now, was my hope, would still remember me, and that I wouldn't have to die. I wanted to make sure that people saw my life as significance. And in order for me to do that, I had to draw a distinction between myself and other people. Like, I'm the significant one, I'm the most significant, and everybody else is not as significant. Because in order to stand out to the human eye, you have to somehow set yourself aside. So a lot of my identity was centered around that neuroses of being afraid to die and being afraid to be forgotten, so that I stand out as this exceptional human being. Meanwhile, this is all the time cutting me off from loving everybody else, because I felt like I had to be the best, I had to be the most interesting, I had to be the most noble, I had to be the something-est, because I couldn't just be a person and be okay with myself, because I hated myself that much. And it was very clear to me during that experience that all of my endeavors toward success were all geared toward basically mitigating feelings of low self-worth and this fear of death. But the experience took that away, because I realized that I would die one day and that I would be forgotten, but that was really beautiful, because I belonged to this cycle, and it was exactly what's supposed to happen. People are supposed to live and die and eventually be forgotten. It becomes that way. And the only thing that makes that scary or sad or in any way is the fact that you've identified with this collection of thoughts that you call I, because you think that that thing is really alive right now. You think that that thing is really real right now. But I'm telling you that the I thought is no more real now than it will be after you pass away and die. And so I know that this sounds like a very morbid thing to bring up, but it immediately released all my fears relative to death, and death became like not even a big deal, just another beautiful cycle in nature. And I was free. For that time, I was completely free. But then after this experience, I went back down to my normal mundane level of consciousness. And after the fact, so I had all of these memories from having lived the experience of higher consciousness, but then I didn't have it in my firsthand experience. And so I did a lot of very foolish things after the fact. And I already knew that the thing that enabled me to experience this beautiful state where nothing could bother me, not even death, I knew that it was because I had been clinging so hard to my identity. And so I sought to repress my ego and to deny myself the ability to have an identity. So because these experiences of ego transcendence were just day and night from my mundane level of consciousness, they were just so much better, so much freer, such profound sanity when I didn't even know that I was insane before, I sought to find my way back to those experiences in any way that I could. And because I didn't directly attribute it to enlightenment or anything like that, I didn't really know how to find the information. And so I did a lot of things just kind of feeling my way around, trying to get back to those experiences. And so I sought to really kind of repress my identity, because I knew that my identity was the thing keeping me away from them. And I did that in many abstract kind of ways that no spiritual teacher would ever advocate for, because they are just so harmful. And so, because I had had particular insights during that experience that came from the state of wisdom, I sought to bring myself in line with those. And in the process, I was repressing the natural tendencies of my ego. So what ego repression is it's basically denying any of your ego drives from their expression. So because I saw myself as inherently not separate from anything else in the world, I tried to behave as though I was not a separate person. And so I came up with very, very weak boundaries. You know, when before I had very strong boundaries and knew exactly who I was, I had essentially chucked out my identity and repressed away my drives for identity. And so after that experience, I tore down my very strong ego. But the thing is that if you're going to have an ego, you want to have a strong ego and not a weak one. A strong ego can ride above the wave and actually ride the wave of life. A weak ego gets crushed under the wave of life, because essentially it takes a certain degree of coping mechanisms to cope with the fact that you're living a lie and living as an illusion. And so you have to essentially be using a lot of crutches whenever you are living under an ego in order for it to be strong. And so you come up with ideas about yourself that are empowering. And so you think, oh yeah, I'm this person, I'm super successful, I have this great thing going for me and that great thing going for me. So this type of ego is self-congratulatory. However, the weak ego is self-deprecating. The self-deprecating ego says, oh, I'm terrible, I can't do anything right, this isn't working out right, they don't know who they are. So the difference between having a strong ego and weak ego is a very significant one if you're going to live under the ego consciousness paradigm. So after I had my experiences and seeing through my ego and going back down into mundane consciousness, still very much living under ego, I had essentially kicked away my crutches. And the thing about when you walk with crutches is that you generally don't tend to do so if you can walk without the crutches. You need the crutches. So I essentially was like, okay, well, you know, if I'm not a separate person, then I don't have to have any boundaries. And so people were able to take advantage of me very, very easily during that time because I was seeking to get back to that state. Or I previously had drives for success in order to make myself feel significant. And so I was always trying to achieve and get A's and be constantly doing things that build myself up. Now I had invalidated all of that, so my grades dropped, but that drive for significance and that need for significance had to be met in some other way. And so I found a less healthy outlet that I just didn't identify as being a striving for significance. So instead of using my merit or my intelligence, I used my sexuality to get attention. Really negative situations with an identity, and realized that so much of my suffering had come from creating an identity and keeping myself protected from embarrassment or feeling negatively about myself. I essentially made myself embarrass myself in situations. Also, another thing was that I sought to get rid of all of my social masks, and so I became brutally honest in a way that, you know, was somewhat socially, it was socially inviolable. So I wouldn't do anything that would directly get me thrown in jail or anything like that, but a lot of people probably thought I was really insane and just downright rude, because I thought, ooh, you know, if I don't put on a social mask, or if I try to be brutally honest, then I can bypass this whole ego thing. So I was essentially repressing all of my drives to be a separate person that's admirable. And that was always what I was trying to do before. I was trying to be an admirable person. I was trying to be a good person, and I was trying to be some kind of successful person. Like I said, I wanted people to see me as this very positive person and to even be remembered as the person that I was and to be interesting. Also, prior to those experiences, I had a very, very clear identity that was very nuanced. And so I had like this rebellious nature, and I had a very clear sense of aesthetic preference. Prior to that, like I was into like goth style clothing, and I had like, certain bands that I would like, and I liked things that were off kilter. And some of those, that was like actually genuinely enjoyment of that, but a lot of it was to adorn the ego. And so I had essentially invalidated that identity of mine. But then a new identity came in its place that was maybe a little bit less interesting and a little bit more vanilla, or sometimes even downright crazy. So the point is, if you try to repress the ego, what you're going to end up with is with a weak ego. And you always want to transcend a strong ego instead of trying to transcend a weak ego. You cannot transcend a weak ego because you're not going to be able to have the self-esteem to actually bring yourself to do that. And essentially, what I did was I spent several years just picking apart my self-esteem and picking apart a positive self-concept in order for me to get back to enlightenment or to get back to that experience that I had. And that's not what you want to do. You want to fully allow your ego into your experience. Because enlightenment has to do with accepting reality as it is and seeing everything as an extension of yourself, you have to realize that your drives to create an ego are the same thing. So you have particular preferences and you have particular ways that you want to seem if you're living under the ego paradigm. And you can't just deny to yourself that those things are there, because that is a denial of reality, and that will set you 100 miles apart from enlightenment. What you have to do is you have to allow those things to come up. You have to allow yourself to see those things and see what they're doing. And it's through direct mindful observation of exactly the process that your ego uses to create those illusions that's going to enable you to see through the illusion of ego. And then you won't have to do anything abstract. You won't have to repress your ego. You won't have to repress any identity drives. It'll just be a release. You'll just be able to let things go. You don't want to force this because it's the ego that wants to repress the ego. And so every time you repress the ego, it's kind of like cutting off the heads of the head of a hydra, and 3 more grow back. It just becomes worse and worse. So you don't want to repress those natural drives that you have to create a separate identity. You don't want to be really abstract with this. If you go intuitively with it, you would think, oh yeah, repressing ego, that's absolutely going to be the best thing to do because you're trying to get rid of ego. But it's a very counterintuitive thing. It's like a Chinese finger trap almost. Like if you pull against it too much, what's going to happen is that it gets tighter. But if you relax and you allow it, then that's when it gets looser and you can actually let go of it. So that's kind of what the nature reminds me of, like a Chinese finger trap, if you've ever seen any of those. So to allow ego, you might find yourself thinking about some kind of self-congratulatory thought. Maybe you're thinking, oh yeah, I'm Mr. Cool Guy, or oh, I did this really well, or I did that really excellent. Go ahead and let that thought be there. Just notice it. Notice that you're not the one that those thoughts are coming from. They just kind of bubble up into your awareness. So when you're actually able to disidentify with that thought, you realize that that thought is just another phenomenon in nature. And so it doesn't need to be suppressed. You can just watch it. And as you watch it mindfully and you see how the ego weaves its stories and tells its lies, that's when you can start to undo it. It'll just kind of naturally sort of undo itself as you start noticing things about how the ego works. If you've ever heard the statement, the truth shall set you free, that's exactly what it means. You just need to get in touch with what is true. So don't seek to transcend the ego. Don't seek enlightenment. Don't seek to repress the ego. Just seek truth. And in order to see the truth for what it is, you have to allow every single aspect of reality and watch it as it is. Because every aspect of reality, including the drive to create ego, has wisdom there. and it gives you a certain type of a release when you start to see how these things work. In fact, there is a type of ego transcendence method called nurture positive, where you're basically taking off your own ego and you're putting on the ego of like an archetypal god or goddess figure. So for example, if I were going to do a nurture positive practice, maybe I would choose the goddess Kali, and I would start taking on more and more of her traits, which of course she's the goddess of destruction, so maybe that might not be the best goddess to choose. But you get the idea. So in seeing how you can reweave that new ego, you can start to see how much of a lie and how much of an illusion that it is. And that's the whole idea there. Now, I've never met anyone who's actually worked with that, nor heard any kind of testimonials from anybody saying that the nurture positive thing worked for them. But it is another method for seeking enlightenment, aside from nurture negative, which is where you're essentially trying to debunk the ego and kind of get rid of the ego. So the idea of ego transcendence is that you just want to see the ego for what it is, which again is a huge collection of thoughts centered around one singular thought that you call I. So once you see through that, that whole thing becomes decentralized to your personality and to your experience of yourself. And so you start to be able to zoom out from the ego. And so there's no need to destroy the ego or to pick apart that whole, the concepts. Those things will release naturally whenever you see that you are not that bundle of thoughts that you've thought that you were for your entire life. So ego transcendence comes about naturally through mindfulness. And so in order to do that, you want to cultivate a mindfulness practice. You can do mindfulness or Vipassana meditation or various other types of meditations where you're observing your internal state as it is. But you want to allow the ego into your experience, because to deny that you have an ego or to deny that you feel like you are the ego is actually a denial of reality as it is. And that will set you 100 miles apart from enlightenment. Alright, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and click the like button below and subscribe. Also, if you're into enlightenment, or if you're into Jungian psychology or anything else about really the under the skin human experience, that's the type of content that I cover on this channel. If you want to get your bearing spiritually and kind of understand exactly what's going on in your psychology, in your firsthand experience, this is definitely the type of channel that you want to subscribe to. I'm personally seeking enlightenment myself, so you're going to see an enlightenment related video every week or every other week. So if that's up your alley, this channel's for you. Other than that, that's all I have for you for now, and until next time, keep becoming more you.